I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're looking at a sort of second-tier May 4th figure, an essayist named Zhu Ziqing, who at the time was fairly well known, but now I think he's kind of been buried in the back end of the anthologies. I actually, before you had mentioned him, I had never encountered Zhu Ziqing. Where did you find him?
Well, it's a funny story, actually. This is a long time ago. This was probably 2006. I had just gotten back to China and was getting my Chinese kind of up. My tutor at the time, I was mentioning, look, I want to try to read some actual Chinese literature. At this time, I didn't know anything except some of the poetry from the 1980s I had read, and I knew, Du Fu and Li Bai. I didn't know anybody else. Didn't even know who Lu Xun was at that point. My tutor, the writer that he said, hey, you need to start with this, was Zhu Ziqing. Zhu Ziqing's essays are, I would say, fairly beloved by lots of Chinese readers. Beloved in a way that, say, Lu Xun's essays aren't. Lu Xun is the challenging writer. He's the sort of the firebrand or the maverick or whatever. Zhu Ziqing's essays, and for that matter, poems, tend to be a little more approachable, and for that reason tend to attract, I won't say a greater readership, but certainly a more popular readership, I think.
And just as a plug, we're going to talk about some of Lu Xun's Zawen in our upcoming series on Lu Xun. We interviewed Professor Andrew Jones at UC Berkeley for a podcast, and that's going to air during this series that's coming up. You were talking about how Lu Xun is perceived as much more difficult than Zhu Ziqing. This essay that we're looking at, which is, how would you translate that, Beiying?
It's the Beiying is sort of, I've seen it translated retreating figure. It's like the image of someone's back.
Yeah, it's more of like looking at someone's back or something like that. It's really a hard title to translate into English.
Right. I remember this essay in particular when my tutor recommended the book. And it's interesting. In some ways, this is sort of the big bang for me with modern Chinese literature, is this essay, because this is the first time, at that point anyway, the first time I had read a modern Chinese piece where I went, wow, that's a pretty striking piece of writing.
And maybe we should just kind of jump into the essay. It's very short. It's maybe like a page or two long. All it is Zhu Ziqing is going back to Beijing University, Beida. His father accompanies him to Nanjing, and they cross the river. At this time, there were no bridges across the Yangtze, so you had to cross the Yangtze at Nanjing by ferry and then take the railroad north to Beijing from the town of Pukou. His father accompanies him. He kind of is fussing all over his son, making sure that he has a good seat, making sure that he's, going to take care of himself when he gets back to Beijing. And then his father goes, and he actually has to struggle across the train tracks to buy some fruit for his son. That image is kind of the one that is referred to in the sort of retreating figure of the title. The he's overweight. That's what the essay tells us. We see the father struggling to get up and down, off the platform and across the tracks and back. That's the image that we're left with, and it's a very kind of sensitive meditation on mortality. The son hasn't seen his father for 2 years, and what he's thinking about now, as he's talking via letter with his father, letters as in snail mail, that thing we used to do 20 years ago. His father is kind of saying, I don't know how much longer I have left, and the son is kind of thinking about this. This is the image that he has when he's talking with his father, and it's I think it's very touching.
The best of the essay form in any culture, I would argue, is stuff like this. It's something that you and I really strive for as writers, and it's very hard to do. It's just to show instead of tell. An essay like this would be very easy to get kind of maudlin and talk about how, time is passing, and my father, just, to wax poetic about how he's going to die soon, how sad things are going to be, whatever. Instead, we get this wonderfully drawn image. When you first hear the title and you hear it's a very famous essay about someone's father, the image that occurred to me before I read it was he's on the train, he's leaving forever, and his father is walking back into the fields with a hoe on his shoulder or something like that, like a classic sort of Dr. Zhivago train moment. And it's not. It's it's in someone else's hands. It could almost be kind of funny because his father's overweight. He's not dressed for this kind of stuff. He has a very traditional garb with a gown and a Mandarin coat and the whole thing. And he's trying to climb up and down platforms with the wrong clothes and very overweight. But in Zhu Ziqing's hands, it's very sensitive. It's before this, the essayist Zhu Ziqing has, as he describes himself at that time, he was thinking to himself, geez, I wish the old man would just leave me alone. Like, I'm a grown-up. I can take care of myself. That's what directly precedes his father going out to buy tangerines for him. It's an immediate shift. He sees his father struggling and just realizes that, wow, my father is not a young man anymore. That's such a, I think most of us have had moments like that with a grandparent, with a parent, somebody just going, wow, that I've never seen them act that way before.
Yeah, certainly having a child of my own, and Rob, you have kids as well. Like watching your parents age as they interact with your child. It's this scary, beautiful, I don't know how to describe it, sense of mortality overcomes you. And that's what I took away from this essay. But the narrator, he seems kind of like a smart aleck at first. Like he's not aware that this is his father showing love to him for maybe what is one of the last times that he will be able to physically do that. And you're right, Rob, this could become very maudlin, but it's not at all maudlin. So Zhu Ziqing is part of the May 4th movement. Right. You know, we've talked about the May 4th movement before. Lucian is this big proponent, but the May 4th movement was all about tearing down these old Confucian values and getting rid of them. 打到空家店 I think was the phrase, you know, overthrow Confucius's old shop, essentially, is the way they sort of irreverently put it. This is almost like 100% Confucian in the sort of respect and love that he shows his father. I mean, this essay is written in 1925, so the May 4th movement is kind of sort of coming to an end, but also this image of an older understanding of imperial China that a lot of these youthful revolutionaries like Zhu Ziqing and Lu Xun had tried to overturn. Zhu Ziqing is born in 1898. He's going to die just before the establishment of the PRC. It's kind of like a meditation not just on his father, which has this relevance for Confucian thinking, but also on sort of the old guard. Rob, 2 questions. How do you read what he's saying about his father and the sort of way that he's coming to recognize that he was a smart aleck at this time, and it's only with later contemplation that he kind of gains this wisdom about what his father was actually doing and how both loving and how intelligent his father was? How do you read that in terms of Confucianism? And question 2. So this is 2 long questions. How does this reflect on Zhu Ziqing's understanding of Chinese culture in general? That larger sense. I mean, Zhu Ziqing is rebelling against Confucianism. What does this essay say about the sort of wider realm?
I had a lot of the same thoughts and questions, actually, because he makes a point of describing his father's clothes. He could have just stuck with he was overweight and had a hard time walking, right? That would have been enough for us to feel kind of sympathy for him. But he makes a point of describing each aspect of his father's clothing to point out that they just don't work. And it is an interesting meditation on his father, but his father's generation as well. A way of, I think, saying, looking back with the benefit of hindsight, they were trying their best. They were doing what they could do, right? They were as constrained by this system as everyone else, but they were still doing their very best. And in fact, it was very meaningful. The problem, and this is where I think I would say he's not giving a particularly deep nod to Confucianism, because his father, it's a very filial move, and then he's expressing veneration for his father in a way, but he's also describing his father's sort of fumbling, almost clownish walk across the railroad tracks. He doesn't look good. He doesn't look like a respectable elder. He looks like a fat old man buying tangerines. in clothes that he shouldn't be wearing on a railroad track. But Zhu Ziqing's appreciation for that tempers it, right? So it's both. It's him saying, you couldn't have continued that way, right? So had my father been able to have different clothes, i.e. perhaps even a different upbringing, something like that, maybe he wouldn't have had to stumble across a railroad tracks and look like a clown. But he did, and it was still kind of touching and meaningful. And what I take away from that a lot is one of the more overlooked things that happens in the May 4th is a conflicted relationship with ancient China, with a lot of the literary tradition. You have these strident sort of calls to get rid of the old and bring in the new, or let's just get rid of this or that. And if you read enough of the writers from that movement, the classics are all over their stuff. They can't just chuck them out the window, right? They still feel a lot of this stuff. Some of the poetry, some of the way the essays are written reflect it. So they have this very conflicted relationship with what came before them. And that's kind of what I see here.
So the clothes, Rob, if I could put it in very symbolic terms, which I know you hate symbolism, the clothes are sort of a symbol of this bygone era that's just not relevant anymore, but he's still feeling this love for his father, even if his father is increasingly irrelevant.
That, and also to point out that the clothes themselves, if we're going to think symbolically, are constraining him. They're preventing him from being the kind of person maybe he could have been. Because early in the essay, we didn't talk much about this, but what brings him back from Beijing down south is that his mother has died and his father's lost his job. So he's kind of helping his dad sort of right the ship. But his father blows all the money he gains from selling a lot of his stuff off on funeral arrangements.
Which is the good Confucian thing to do, right?
Very Confucian, and it's one of the reasons he had no money. So there's this strand running through where Zhu Ziqing is kind of rolling his eyes at this older tradition, like, God, look at this stuff, man. It's bankrupting people. It's giving them clothes. It prevents them from moving. It can prevent them from moving and all this. And yet, through all of that, you still have a man trying to do a wonderful thing for his son. And I find that very moving and very humanizing, to have a critique of an older system, but then also say, still, he was my dad. You know, it's kind of hard to just, to critique it too much.
You can hate where you came from, but there's still a lot of love involved in those sort of early childhood memories. And even if you had a bad parent, which I'm not accusing Zhu Ziqing's father of being a bad parent. I am saying that Zhu Ziqing is accusing that generation and that old guard of being bad people and representing values that need to be abandoned. Even if you have this bad upbringing, you never really are able to completely let go.
And it's interesting because it's at the moment when he turns his back and walks away. That's the title of the essay. The image that sticks with him is not his father standing on the platform waving goodbye. It's him when he's not talking, when he's not being the kind of person that at that time irritated the young Zhu Ziqing or the young narrator. It's him just doing a very human thing, trying to serve someone else and make their lives better. And that kind of cuts through a lot of the noise, the context, the stuff that the narrator had been critiquing probably for a long time. It's just a man doing something that's a little too hard for him physically to make his son happy. And that's kind of a universal. I think it's the essayist recognizing a universal in something his father was doing, that old or new, this is still a beautiful thing.
As we start to wrap this up, I kind of wish we had done this on Father's Day. It's such a...
I kind of do too, yeah.
Maybe this is just a time for the listener to kind of think about the values that we bring and that we, as teenagers, I think modern teenagers all rebel against the previous generation. They all, try and cut themselves off from their parents. I think that's what's going on with Zhu Ziqing. And Rob, you talked about how universal this is. There's something shared in all modern cultures, that sort of teenagey angst, like you think you know much more than your parents, and actually you don't know quite as much as you think you do. Maybe you do know more, but there's always this need to kind of temper your pride that you get coming out of those teen years. And that's really what I took away from this essay, and the way that he is kind of struggling to deal with his feelings, both for his father and the older form of Chinese culture that he's simultaneously trying to abandon and can't quite let go of.
And my closing thought here is, we don't get his father's take on what his son is doing. Assuming that the narrator is Zhu Ziqing, his father has to know that by this time Zhu Ziqing has written a lot of critiques and maybe against a lot of the old tradition, right? And so perhaps is feeling kind of silly or dismissed. Who knows? Who knows how his father's feeling, right? His father's action is very challenging for him, for the narrator, because, like you say, it's very easy in your early 20s to be like, psh, I know way more than that old man, right? True, maybe, but this isn't about knowing, right? Would you do something like this? Are you willing to look silly just to serve someone else? That's a different level of giving, of sacrifice even, that the young narrator, I don't think, at the time even really understood. And it's a hard one, right? Because it's tempting to think we know better, but inevitably something happens where we realize, hopefully, I'm actually not doing as much as I think I'm doing, but I'm actually neglecting a lot of very simple human gestures that would actually make things a lot better.
I think that's a great place to end it. I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.